5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear, and today we're traveling down to El Paso, Texas. The reason being is I came here for work, and I've done a lot of research, and this is a very haunted town. So we're not going to El Paso to pass through. No. Not the one with traffic, lights, restaurants, border crossings, and everyday life moving like nothing ever happened here. Not today, anyway. We're stepping into a part of El Paso that never quite moved on. We're stepping into the Concordia Cemetery. And I want you to picture this the right way, because if you get the image wrong, you miss the entire feeling of this place. This is not some tucked away graveyard behind a church. No, this is not a quiet little patch of land where people go, grieve, and leave. This is a city of the dead, wide open, sun-bleached, old in a way that you can feel before you even understand it. You got sections in the cemetery that stretch out in different directions. You got different cultures buried side by side, but still separated in the way they were in life. Old headstones that are worn down to almost nothing. Names you can barely read anymore. Dates go back far enough to remind you that people were living, fighting, building, and dying here long before anything around it looked the way it does now. And what gets me about Concordia is that it doesn't hide. There's no heavy forest around it, no fog rolling in, no shadows to tuck things away. It sits under the Texas sun, open, exposed, and somehow, some way, it's still heavy. Because this isn't just a cemetery. This is where El Paso buried its history. And I mean all of it. You've got lawmen, you've got railroad workers, you've got outlaws, immigrants, families, children, soldiers, people who came here chasing opportunity, and people who died before they ever found it. You've got people who built this city and people who made sure it stayed dangerous. It is a border town and has been. And when all of that gets buried in one place over time, something starts to change. Not in a dramatic movie style way, and not in a you hear chains rattling at midnight kind of way, like creeping across the floor. No, it's quieter than that. It's heavier than that. It's the kind of place where you can be standing there in the middle of the day, full of sunlight, and still feel like you're not alone. Like something is aware of you being there. And that's what makes Concordia different, because some of the most unsettling encounters, they don't happen at night. They happen in broad daylight. People walking, people working, people just passing through. And suddenly, something feels off. Something moves where nothing should be moving. Or worse, someone appears where no one should be. And that's where we're going today. We're going to walk this place the right way. We're going to start with the ground itself, the history, what built this place into what it is. Then we're going to move into the people that are buried here, and one name that still carries weight after all these years. Then we'll get into a couple of encounters, the woman in black, the figure near the grave that doesn't move like the living, the parts of the cemetery that feel different depending on where you stand. Of course, we're going to touch on something darker that happened in this place. Something modern, something people don't always like to bring up, because Concordia doesn't just hold old history. It has layers, and some of those layers are closer to us than we like to admit. So settle in, because this just isn't a normal ghost story. This is a place where history never fully settled. If you really want to understand Concordia, you have to stop thinking of it just as a cemetery and start thinking of it as a timeline that never cleaned up. Because this place didn't form around one event. It didn't grow out of one tragedy. And that matters here, because places like that don't feel the same as normal burial grounds. They still don't. They feel accumulated. Concordia dates back to the 1800s, right when El Paso was still figuring out what it even was. And you got to remember, This wasn't a calm place back then, okay? This was the edge of things. This was the edge of countries, the edge of law, the edge of survival. You had people coming through from all different directions. Mexico, the deeper parts of Texas, the West, rail lines bringing workers, travelers, soldiers, people looking for money, people running from something, people trying to start over. And when you have that kind of movement, you also have death that comes with it. Not peaceful death, hard death, disease, violence, accidents. Long work days under brutal conditions, people who didn't have time to age properly, and people who didn't get soft endings. And all of them, they ended up here, okay? But what makes Concordia different is how those people were buried. Because this wasn't one unified space, it was divided. You had separate sections from different groups, different religions, different cultures, different social standings, Catholic sections, Protestant sections, Chinese burial areas, Jewish sections, military plots, family plots, unmarked areas. And when you walk through it, even now, you can feel those divisions. I wouldn't say you can feel them in a political way, more of like a presence way. Like the cemetery isn't one voice, it's multiple, sometimes quiet, sometimes overlapping, and sometimes clashing. And that alone creates something most cemeteries don't have: variation. Because energy, whether you believe in it spiritually or just emotionally, doesn't spread evenly in places like this. It settles in pockets, and Concordia has a lot of pockets. You can walk one stretch and feel almost calm. Then take a few steps and something changes. The air feels tighter, your focus sharpens without you meaning for it to. You start paying attention to things you weren't noticing before. That's the kind of place this is. And then there's the environment itself. This isn't a forest cemetery. This isn't some overgrown place where nature has swallowed everything. No, this is desert ground, dry, open, sun hitting everything. No real place for shadows to hide during the day. And that should make you feel safer. It should, but instead, it does quite the opposite. Because when something feels off in a place where nothing should be hidden, it stands out more. A movement where there shouldn't be movement, a figure where there shouldn't be a person, a shape that doesn't match anything around it. And your brain doesn't have an easy place to file it. And that's where Concordia starts getting its reputation. Because over time, enough people have had those moments that it stopped being coincidence and it started becoming a story. Before we even get to the encounters, there's one more thing about this place, and that's the type of lives buried here. Because this isn't just a cemetery full of ordinary death. This place holds people tied to violence, to reputation, to movements that didn't end clean. And when those kinds of lives get buried in one place, they don't always feel like they settle the same way. Some graves feel quiet, some feel heavier. And there's one grave in particular where people have been saying for a long time, that it does not feel empty. And that's what we're about to get into. There's a lot of names in Concordia Cemetery. Thousands if you really start counting them. Most of them you walk past without thinking. Worn stone, it's dates, maybe a last name that still exists somewhere within the city. But then again, maybe not. But every now and then you hit a name that doesn't just sit there, it carries something with it. And in Concordia, one name stands out above all the others, and that is John Wesley Hardin. Now, here's the thing. You don't even have to know his full story to feel the weight of that name. Because Hardin wasn't just some guy who got into a few fights. He was a product of the Old West at its roughest, and also one of the men who helped define what the roughness would look like: violent, fast, unpredictable. A man who built his reputation on being quicker than the other person, and he was willing to prove it. And when you start digging into him, you realize real quick, this wasn't some clean, cinematic outlaw story. This was messy. This was human. This was the kind of life that leaves behind more tension than closure. Because Hardin's story didn't end in some final showdown out in the open. It ended in El Paso, inside a saloon, shot from behind, no warning, no fair fight, just over. And when you think about that, it kind of makes sense. It digs into the outlaw way of life, right? The whole showdown at noon thing was Hollywood. That's not really what they did. They didn't have a shootout in the middle of the street. They might have, but they didn't say draw and take off, because people like that, people who lived hard, fast, violent lives and then died suddenly like that, they don't get a clean ending. And Concordia is where the ending landed. Now imagine for a second, a man known for being dangerous, a man who built his entire identity on control, speed, and dominance. And his life ends in a moment where he has none of that. No control, no reaction, no chance, just gone and then buried right here, in a cemetery already full of unfinished stories. That alone is enough to make people stop when they reach his grave, But that's not where it stops. Because over time, people started noticing something about that area. Not loud, not dramatic, not some full body ghost walking around tipping his hat. It's quieter than that. And that's what makes it stick. People talk about a shift, a feeling, like the air changes just slightly when you get close. Not colder exactly, just tighter, more focused, you could say. Like you stepped into a space that's paying attention back. And most people brush that off at first because it's a cemetery. You're already going into a cemetery thinking of ghosts. But then there are moments that don't brush off so easy. People walking past the graves and catching movement out of the corner of their eye. Not wind, not an animal, but something upright, something human shaped. And when they turn, it's gone. The feeling doesn't leave. That's just the part that gets people. Because usually when your brain tricks you, that feeling fades once you correct it, once you realize there's nothing there. But here, it doesn't always. Sometimes it just lingers. Like whatever you thought you saw didn't fully go away. There are also reports, quiet ones, not the kind you see blown up online, of a shadow near his grave, not solid, not detailed, but shaped, man-shaped, standing where no one was a second before, and gone just as quick. Now, here's where I'll slow this down because this part right here, I need you to pay attention to. Nobody credible is saying they've seen a full, clear figure of Hardin walking around. That's not the story. The story is presence. The story is impression. The story is something about that spot that feels occupied in a way that doesn't match the rest of the cemetery. And when you think about who he was, it kind of makes sense why that would be the form it takes, because Hardin's life wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't gentle. So if anything, some of that might have carried over into the afterlife with him. It wouldn't show up as something soft. It would show up as pressure, awareness, tension. And that's exactly what people are describing when they feel this thing. Like you stepped into a place where you're being sized up, not attacked, not chased, but just noticed. Like you walk into an old saloon and the guy notices you. And that's a very specific kind of fear because it's not immediate. It doesn't give you something to run from. It just sits there with you and it lets your mind do the rest. There's also something else that adds to it. And that's the type of visitors his grave attracts. You get people who come specifically to see it and people who already know the stories and people who already feel something before they even arrive. And when enough attention builds around one spot like that, over years, decades, it changes how the place feels. Whether you're looking at this spiritually or psychologically or somewhere in between, it builds something in your mind. And Concordia already had the foundation for that. Hardin's grave just became one of the focal points. But here's the part that makes this even more interesting. Right? Even people who didn't know where his grave was have reported that same kind of feeling in that area, which takes it out of the your brain is expecting it category and puts it somewhere else, somewhere harder to explain. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you definitively that his spirit is standing there. But what I will tell you is that when enough people describe the same kind of presence in the same place over time, you start paying attention because places remember, people leave impressions. And Concordia is full of both. But Hardin's grave, that one doesn't feel like it faded all the way. It feels like something about it stayed sharp. And that's just one part of the cemetery. Because the next story, it doesn't happen at night. And it doesn't happen near one specific grave. And it doesn't feel like a leftover from violence. It feels like something else entirely. Something slower, something quieter, something that walks. And people have seen her in the middle of the day. If you've ever had a paranormal experience, having them at night is different, but something about those daytime encounters, it just hits different because at night it gives you an excuse. Shadows move, your vision plays tricks, your brain fills in gaps, you can explain things away if you really wanted to. But when something happens in the middle of the day, full sunlight, no cover, no darkness to hide behind, that's when it sticks. And that's exactly where this next encounter lives. We're right back inside Concordia Cemetery in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Now, this wasn't some random visitor just walking around for the first time. This was someone who worked the ground, someone who spends their days there. That's how they make their money, driving it, walking it, seeing it in all kinds of conditions. And when you talk to people like that, you pay attention a little more because they know what normal looks like out there. They know how the light hits. They know how people move. They know what belongs and what doesn't. So on this particular afternoon, everything starts normal. He's driving slowly through the cemetery, checking the grounds. He's keeping an eye out, nothing out of place, just another shift. And then, off in the distance, he sees her. At first, nothing about this seems wrong, just a person walking. That happens all the time in the cemetery. People visit, people wonder, people take their time, especially a historical place like Concordia. But something about the way she's moving catches his attention. So he slows down a little and he's watching her, and that's when the details start to come in. He describes her as an older woman, small, frail, wearing all black, not just black clothes, but like she had just came from a funeral or church. That kind of black. A dress, a veil over her face. Now that alone is already putting this encounter out of place. You don't really see that anymore. Nobody really dresses like that, okay? Not just walking along through a cemetery in the middle of the day, but I'm not saying it's impossible, but you just don't see it. So at this point, the guy, he's starting to get rational. He's still grounded, just watching, but then he notices how she's walking. And this is where it starts to shift because it's not natural, not smooth, not fluid. It's stiff, awkward, almost mechanical. Like her body isn't quite moving in the way it should. Her posture is hunched. Her steps are uneven, but not in a normal elderly person way. I'm guessing he said it's off. Enough so that it makes him pay closer attention. So now he's slowly driving in her direction, not fast, not aggressive, just easing forward, trying to figure out if she needs help. Because that's part of his job. And as he gets closer, he expects one of two things. Either she'll hear the vehicle and turn around, or she'll step off the path, acknowledge him in some way, because that's what people do. But she doesn't. She keeps walking. Same pace, same stiff movement, never reacting. And now he's close enough that this isn't a distant figure anymore. This is right here in his face, clear, visible, no question about what he's looking at. So he slows even more, almost crawling at this point, watching her, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. And then he calls out. Nothing loud, just enough to get her attention. Not even a pause. She doesn't look back. She just keeps moving. And that's when he says the feeling starts creeping in. That quiet shift in your psyche, that sense that something isn't lining up the way it should. So he pulls a little closer, and now he's right behind her, close enough that if she were a normal person, she would absolutely know someone was there. She doesn't turn. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't react. She just keeps moving. And now he's fully focused on her because this has gone from maybe someone needs help to something's not right. So he edges forward just enough to pull alongside her. And this is the moment, the one that sticks with him, the one he remembered clear enough to tell it later, because as he comes up beside her, he looks over, and for a split second, he expects to see a face behind the veil, some kind of expression, eyes, recognition, anything. But what he sees instead doesn't line up with that expectation, because there's no face, there's no movement behind the veil, no reaction, just absence. And that gives me the absolute chills. As he's going into this, like the space where a person should be isn't presenting like one. And before he can fully process that, she disappears. No running, no turning, no stepping away, just disappears. It's not there anymore. The same path, same open ground, nowhere to hide, no time to move that fast, and nothing. He stops right there because now it's not confusion anymore. It's heavy realization. That moment where your brain tries to grab onto something normal and it can't. He gets out, looks around, nothing, no footprints, no person walking, no explanation that fits what just happened, just the same old cemetery. Now feeling very different than it did a few minutes ago. But that's the part of the story that matters to me. Not just that he saw her, but that it happened in a place where it shouldn't have worked like that. Open space, daylight, clear line of sight, and still something moved through that environment. Like it wasn't bound to it the same way we are. Now, people who've heard that story, they usually latch onto the image. The black dress, the veil, the old world look. And yeah, that's unsettling, but what really sticks is the movement and the disappearance. Because those are the parts you can't dress up and explain away easily. And here's where it connects back to Concordia itself, because this cemetery is full of layered history. Different cultures, different burial traditions, different ways of mourning. And that image, that veiled woman, it doesn't just belong in one story. It overlaps, it echoes, it fits too many possibilities at once, which makes it harder to pin down. And maybe that's the point, because not everything in a place like this wants to be understood clearly. Some things just pass through, seen for a moment, then gone. And if that was the only story, it would already be enough. But Concordia doesn't stop at one encounter, because there are other areas, other moments where people feel things without ever seeing anything at all. Sometimes that's worse. So by the time you've walked through Concordia Cemetery, you've started to realize something. Not every part of this place feels the same. And I don't mean emotionally, like this section is sadder or this part is older. I mean physically, noticeably. Like the environment itself shifts depending on where you're standing. Now, most people don't pick up on it right away, especially when they're just visiting. They walk through, look at a few graves, maybe find a name they recognize, take a picture, and leave. But the people who spend time there, the workers, the locals, people who walk it more than once, they're starting to notice patterns. Not the kind we've been trying to avoid overusing, but real lived in observations. Certain areas feel lighter, almost neutral. You can walk through them, read headstones, take your time. Nothing really presses on you. Then there are the areas where something shifts. Subtle at first. You get a little more aware of your surroundings. You start looking around more. Your pace changes without you deciding to slow down. And then there are the spots where it feels like the air itself tightens, like you stepped into something that isn't just there, but is aware of you being there. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where people either lean too far into it or they dismiss it completely. But when enough people have described the same type of feeling in the same kind of areas over time, you don't ignore that. You study it, and Concordia has those areas, pockets, zones, call them whatever you want. But they're real enough that people who know the cemetery know where they are. Some of them aren't even trying to find specific graves, and that's what makes it stranger. You expect a heavy feeling to sit on top of a known burial, someone important, someone violent, someone remembered, but sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes it sits in between, in the space, and that raises a different kind of question. Because if it's not tied to one person, then what is it tied to? And that's where the history comes back in, because Concordia isn't just layered by individuals, it's layered by events, by eras, by waves of people coming through and leaving pieces of themselves behind. And not all those pieces were clean. Now there's another part of this that people don't always like talking about openly because it brings you a little closer to modern times, a little closer to us, closer to something that feels less like history and more like intention. And there have been quiet mentions over the years of people using parts of the cemetery for rituals. Nothing confirmed in an official document, stamped and sealed away neatly somewhere, never to be seen again. But enough talk, enough local awareness that it doesn't come out of nowhere. And when you start hearing that, you start looking at the place differently. Because now you're not just dealing with what's buried there, you're dealing with what might have been brought in later. And there's one name that gets mentioned carefully, almost like people don't want to give it too much attention. And I'm talking about the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Now, I'm not going to sensationalize this. That's not what this is. But there have been claims, stories that during his time moving through different parts of the Southwest, he had connections to places like this. Places with history, places with death already embedded into the ground, places where if someone wanted to do something symbolic, something dark, they wouldn't pick somewhere random. They'd pick somewhere like Concordia. And again, nothing we're presenting here is fact carved in stone. But when you combine that idea with the place already carrying decades of layered history, it adds another weight to it. Because now you're not just dealing with the past, you're dealing with the possibility that something was done before, long after the original burials. Human intention leaves marks. And that's not even a paranormal statement, that's just reality. Places where bad things happen repeatedly, they start to feel different. Places where people bring dark intent, they feel different. And Concordia has enough of both. That those zones people talk about start making a little more sense, because maybe it's not one source, maybe it's not one spirit, maybe it's an accumulation of spirits, layers on top of layers, old grief, old violence, old identities, and possibly newer actions added into that mix, all sitting in the same ground. You step into one of those spots and your body picks up on it before your brain does. You get quiet, you look around, you feel like you're being watched, but not in a sharp, aggressive way, more like you've entered a space that already has something in it. And it noticed you crossed into it. Now, some people leave those areas quickly without really thinking about why. Others stay trying to figure it out, trying to prove themselves. It's nothing, but either way, they remember where it happened. And that's the one thing about Concordia. You don't always leave a clear story. You don't always leave with something you can point to and say, hey, that's what I saw. Sometimes you leave with just a feeling that followed you a little longer than it should. And honestly, that can be worse, because at least with something visible, you can try to explain it. When it's just a shift in the air, a pressure you can't see, a pressure you can't confirm, that's where your mind starts doing the work. And that's where places like this stay with you. And after everything we've walked through, the history, the names, the encounters, the feeling, in certain parts of Concordia Cemetery, you start to realize something. This place was never meant to be simple. And I don't mean complicated like mystery you can solve, Scooby-Doo gang. I mean complicated like something doesn't have a clean answer, and it never will. Because Concordia isn't built around one story, it's built around thousands of them. Some end quietly, some end violently, some end suddenly, and some probably just don't feel finished at all. And when all of that stacks in one place, it doesn't just disappear, you know? Now, whether you believe in ghosts as actual spirits or you think it's more of an energy memory, an imprint, it's almost that doesn't matter here because something about Concordia holds on. You feel it in a way the ground doesn't feel empty. You feel it in the way certain areas shift your attention without warning. You feel it standing near a grave like John Wesley Hardin's, where the story didn't end clean and maybe never settled right. You feel it in encounters like the woman in the veil, who didn't belong to the space the way a living person should, and still moved through it like she knew exactly where she was going. And you feel it in parts of the cemetery where nothing happens, but everything feels like it could. And that might be the most honest way to describe Concordia. It's not loud, it's not trying to scare you. It doesn't need to. It just exists the way it always has, holding on to everything that's been put into it. And if you spend enough time there, you start to feel like you're not just walking through a cemetery. You're walking through layers, through time that never fully separated itself, through people who lived very different lives but ended up sharing the same background. And maybe that's why places like this don't let go, because they were never just about death. They were about everything leading up to it, every decision, every moment, every unfinished piece, all of it ending up in the same place. And every now and then, something from that rises just enough to be noticed. Not clearly, not completely, but just enough. Enough to make you stop. Enough to make you question what you just saw or what you just felt. And enough to make you remember it long after you've left. And that's the part, not the fear, not the stories, but the idea that some places don't need to prove anything to you. They just wait. And if you're paying attention, they'll show you exactly as much as you're meant to see. No more, no less. So, if you ever find yourself in El Paso and you decide to take a walk through Concordia, just take your time, stay aware, and don't assume that because it's quiet, that nothing's there. Because sometimes the quiet is where everything is. Thank you for your attention tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Polar Bear. And if you've had an experience with something like this, or you've been to a haunted place, or you've had an encounter with a cryptid and you want to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is polarbearhoth@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, or Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. Until next time, folks, stay safe on that highway out there.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.